Okay, so welcome everyone to our Disabled Students workshop for the elections this year. So if everyone wants to keep their microphones off for now, and we'll have a Q&A section at the end, or when prompted, you guys would love you to interact, and you don't need to turn your camera on, whatever you're comfortable with. So today we're going to cover the information about the roles, so giving you the basic information about what roles there are in our election, how you go about nominating yourself, and information about the key dates and campaigning and support. You'll also learn the skills that you might gain as a student representative as a little taster, and also hear from the wonderful Amelia, who's going to talk to us about her experience as a disabled student in a sabbatical officer role, and you'll have a chance to ask questions as well if you have any. So we're doing this session because we recognise that disabled students are often underrepresented in YUSU officer roles, especially sabbatical officer roles, and it's something we really want to actively address. So we want to make sure that all students know these roles are open for them, and know if there are any adjustments you need, then we are open to making adjustments and making it fair for everyone, whatever platform you need. And we know that a diverse officer team makes for a better YUSU, and it makes us all a more proactive and representative team. So to start off with, what are the elections all about? So the basics about the elections. First off, as an introduction to an election, it's all about nominations, campaigning and voting. So students nominate themselves for a position, they then campaign to gain votes, and all students then have a vote, and that makes the students that are elected representative of the student body, and they then have a mandate to make change. The roles that you can go for in this election are, first off, are sabbatical officer roles, which are full-time jobs where you get paid a wage, so you become a full-time staff member of the union. You can either do this after your degree or by taking a year out. So they are union president, academic officer, activities officer, York Sport president, and community and wellbeing officer. Secondly, we have our part-time officer roles, which are voluntary roles that you take up alongside your studies. You can take these up with a friend and run as a pair, so you can effectively job share if you win. These are either liberation roles, or they can also be coordination roles. So we have RAG and volunteering, who coordinate those activities. We then have campaigning networks, including environment and ethics, who coordinate activities and campaign on environmental issues. And then we have our liberation and campaign roles that represent certain factions of students. So, for example, BAME, disabled, mature, LGBTQ, women and non-binary, international and working class. Then finally, we have our non-officer roles, which are the faculty reps. So you'll be an academic representative of your faculty. And then we have non-political roles, which are slightly different, where you don't run on a manifesto of change. It's more of a governance-based role where you would put a statement. And these are student trustee, of which we have 3 open positions, and then accountability and scrutiny chair. All of these roles are on our mini site, and they have a role description to go into more detail of what each one is about and the kind of time commitment and expectations there'll be with each role. The timeline of the elections is starting with nominations in week 5. So they open online on the 8th of February, and you'll have 2 weeks to submit your nomination. We then move on to a week called Development Week, where you'll have the opportunity to edit your manifesto and get in contact with support and people who might help you with it. And also there'll be workshops which you can go along to, such as how to campaign, how to publicly speak, how to develop your manifesto, so they can really enhance your skills during that week whilst you're preparing for campaigning. So then we get on to campaigning, which starts at the end of week 8 and runs through to the end of week 9. Campaigning we'll go into a little bit later. And then voting is at the end of week 8 through week 9, and this will all be online, the voting, ending with results night on the Saturday, the 13th of March. So what you'll need to nominate, this is what you can prepare in advance if you want to be ready for nominations opening. First off, you'll need a manifesto. The best manifestos are simple, and the idea with a manifesto is to show what you want to change, what you're passionate about, and why you want to do the role. It's only 500 words, so it doesn't need to be a big essay, and it's best to start with 3 bullet points that summarize what you're wanting to say. You'll also have a blurb, which is just a 100-character box where you can put an introduction to yourself or your campaign slogan. And then finally, you'll need a photo. This needs to be an individual headshot if you're running on your own, or you can have a joint headshot with your running mates, or if that's not possible because of local restrictions, you can send in 2 individual headshots and we'll merge them for you. So campaigning can be a lot of fun, and this year it is all online, so you don't have to worry about going out on campus and putting up posters and spending lots of time campaigning outside. It's all online because of local restrictions, and this means that it's fair for everyone on a level playing field. And you'll get advice during that development week about the best ways to communicate online, and we can support you with that. But it's a great chance to be really creative, and you can have support from your friends whilst campaigning as well. So the support you can get from us is, first off, YUSU has staff contacts for every role. And you're welcome to get in contact with those at any time. We'll be publicising that contact list next week. However, in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can email us directly. They are there, the staff are there to answer any of your questions and help you with your manifesto if you have any queries. They are experts in how things run, so they can really help you hone your manifesto in terms of what is feasible and what's not. Secondly, we'll have a page on our website called the Candidate Hub, and this will have resources like guides and our workshop recordings that you can go back and watch, and you can really develop your skills and interests from those there. That is where the staff contacts will also be shared. So on the Candidate Hub, like I say, there will be guides such as how to campaign, how to make your campaigning accessible, the information about student rights and activism. And then finally, as I say, if you have any questions at all, your first port of call is elections@usu.org, and we can pass it on. If you want to talk to a direct staff contact, we can pass that on as well. So I'm going to pass over to Nick now, who's going to talk a bit about the skills you can gain as a student representative.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I'm going to touch upon two areas. So the benefits of running in the YUSU election, because I think there are lots of benefits to the campaigning period, and then obviously if you get the role as a SAB or a part-time officer as well, there are obviously key benefits and skill developments that you'll gain from that too. So first slide, Laura. And the bullet points will come down. Oh, cool, brilliant. Yeah, and Amelia, I'll come to you and ask you on the next slide what you think the key skills are, but I'll get through this slide first, if that's all right. So, running in the election, I think there's a real opportunity to develop new skills and pick up new things, but also to hone what you're already doing. So manifesto development and doing a campaign plan is really good experience for project planning. Think about your manifesto and think about the campaign plan you put in place, how to mobilize your friends and other students, and how you're going to communicate. And think about that when you're applying for jobs and doing application forms as well, because that is a really good example of project planning. And also influencing skills. So running in the election, you're going to have to try and influence your fellow students and others in terms of your ideas, and that's a really good way of honing your ability to be an activist and to put forward ideas for change in a really engaging way. And also during the election, obviously it'll be online this year, but there's still going to be opportunities for you to speak publicly. So going along to events, the debate nights we put on as well, and just speaking to other students in a digital capacity as well. So I think even though that's going to be a bit different, there's still lessons you're going to learn about public speaking there. And then also the ability and the capacity to engage with different students. You're going to have to communicate to different audiences and different groups of students, different student groups, in order to get elected. So again, reflecting on that in a job interview or an application, that ability to communicate across groups, but also using different methods as well, is a key skill. And then finally, it's going to be good fun, hopefully, in the main. But there are always challenges. I'm sure Amelia can testify to that when running for elections. So I think overcoming those challenges and dealing with those ups and downs in a positive way is something that you can really get out of putting yourself forward. And again, something you can talk about when you're reflecting for job interviews, job applications. Next slide. So when you actually get elected, here are some of the skills that I've picked out, but I thought, Amelia, I'll ask you first, because I've never been a SAB, and I know you have. So what do you think the key benefits were in terms of skill development for you?
Probably all of the slide and more. I think being a SAB is a really unique role in that you're doing about 7 things all at the same time. It sounds overwhelming, but is actually like a really good experience of when you're like leading an institution at the same time as doing your own campaigns, at the same time as talking to individual students, and you kind of see all your work at different levels of that work. And I honestly don't think there's any job or role that gives you that opportunity. So you can be, in Parliament giving evidence on the Tuesday, be then reporting that back to the higher management of the university on the Thursday, and then on the Friday be talking to like a group of students that are reps or individual students, and then talking to them on like individual level. And I don't think there's anything that gives you that opportunity necessarily. I would say probably the best skill that I learned in my particular year, which was last year, so just as the pandemic was happening, was just to take every day as it comes. was
Yeah.
kind of the skill that I got, and kind of being very kind to your kind of workmates and students, and just kind of doing everything in a very collective manner, because I think
Yeah.
especially at the current time, I think the kind of typical ideas of what a SAB is and what they do, and you know, all the kind of activities has kind of changed quite significantly, and I think being open to that change is really quite important. I mean, I did half of the year as a traditional SAB, and half the year working from home in a pandemic, and I think that being able to kind of be a part of that change and really keep everything like afloat, and keep your projects, and like be open to change in, I think, a lot of ways that you couldn't have expected when you were kind of looking into being a SAB. Like, it changes very quickly, and I think that's very much helped me in the job that I currently have, being able to say I've been a SAB in a pandemic. I kind of know how to handle this. Has been something that's been really, really helpful.
Yeah.
So, sorry, that was a bit of a long
No,
winded answer.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I mean, I almost don't have to do the do the slide now, but yeah, no, that's really good to hear. And I really enjoyed what you said about that kind of empathy and collectivity, because it's really important for you guys out there thinking about running the elections. I think being empathetic to fellow students, but also trying to cultivate a kind of sense of hope. You know, it's really difficult at the minute, isn't it? In this situation, there's lots of despair, there's lots of negative things happening, but you know, the SAB role, student unions, and higher education in general should be a force for kind of that critical hope, shouldn't it? You know, we're about changing things positively, so being able to cultivate that with other students is really important. So yeah, leading change, as Amelia talked about, is a really crucial skill that you'll build on and develop in the role. And I think it's as a SAB as well. SAB is obviously the full-time job, and it's one of the best first-time jobs you'll have. But even as part-time officers and other reps, it's a really great opportunity to be able to demonstrate your ability and build on your ability to influence others and do campaigns and lead change in the university, but also beyond as well, obviously through the national movement and in the community. As Amelia touched upon as well, I think just the breadth of people you have to engage with on a obviously on a daily basis for SABs, but for other officers, part-time officers, maybe slightly less commonly, but you know, university staff, academics, senior people, other students, external organisations, you'll get all that. So when you're applying for jobs, which I'm sure you did, Amelia, that question about diverse relationships or communicating across different stakeholder groups, it's a perfect example to use as a part-time officer or a SAB. And then project management, which every employer asks about. It's sometimes a bit of a difficult one to describe. I think certainly we've been recruiting. It's difficult for people to demonstrate that through an example sometimes, but there are so many examples that part-time officers and SABs can choose, I think. And you know, just that idea of having a budget, having to work to timelines and deadlines, and creating theories of change, working with students on defining their aims about what they actually want to change is a really good way to hone your experience and build that knowledge of project management. And then I think the bottom two are, I suppose, what we call soft skills, but are really key, I think, perks of the job, perks of being a part-time officer and definitely a sabbatical officer as well, in that you will have to juggle many different priorities, many conflicting priorities at once. Your day is never going to be the same, isn't that? I think that's right, isn't it, Amelia? It's both scary in that sense, but also really never boring. I think is definitely the thing. But yeah, so that ability to juggle, you'll definitely develop in your year as an officer, sabbatical or part-time. And then resilience as well, which I think is super important at the minute, as we stressed, but is important in a pre-COVID world and post-COVID world as well. So that ability and that capacity to overcome challenges and be able to sometimes sit with difficult situations, I think a good example of that would be sitting with students or university colleagues who we maybe disagree with, and embracing some of that conflict, being resilient to when people have different views, and maybe are critical of us as well, and being able to absorb that and move on constructively is a really key skill to being a great officer, and then in your future careers as well. The next slide is just the workshops, isn't it? Yeah. So yeah, so for you guys out there, and Charlotte, and obviously Amelia as well, there's other skills workshops that we're doing next week and the week after as well. So I'll be doing a workshop on student activism, which is going to be great. And I mentioned, I did a plug for the concept of critical hope then, which we'll cover in my workshop. I think that's really important. So hopefully that workshop will give you some practical tools and will frame activism in the context of leadership, because for me, leaders are activists, and sometimes we get those confused, and people talk about them as if they're separate things. So that's that session. There'll be an introduction to leadership as well, and then a taster on professional communication, which I think for sabbatical, for those of you thinking about sabbatical roles in particular, just learning how you communicate with different groups and some of those different techniques. So maybe on the same issue, you're going to communicate with students and then senior managers really differently. So just giving you an introduction to that. And then resilience as well. We've got a really cool workshop lined up with someone from the Open Door team. Amelia, that's our counselling service at York, who's going to give some practical tips on dealing with pressure and stress during that busy election time of campaigning. And then we're also going to hear from a previous SAB at York, Ben Leatham, who's going to talk about resilience in the context of his experience as a sabbatical officer and running in the election as well. And then a introduction to project management as well on the 11th of Feb. So do come along to those skills workshops, they're going to be great. And that's everything from me.
Yes, thank you, Nick. So I'm going to move on to Amelia now, who we've already heard a little bit from, but we're going to hear some more. So Amelia was the Welfare and Liberation Sabbatical Officer at Durham SU 2019 to 2020, and she's going to tell us a bit about her experience as a student who identifies as disabled in a sabbatical officer role. So thank you so much for coming, Amelia, and we'll just swap screens if you want to pop your share your screen for us.
Yep, let me just hope that the technology is with me. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, that's great.
Awesome. Oh, already had a slight technical hitch. So hi, I'm Amelia McLaughlin. There's a few parts to this presentation, so quite luckily I'm going to cover my time as a part-time officer. So previous to my sabbatical role as Welfare and Liberation, I was actually the president of our Disabled Students Association for about 3.5 years. And that's actually, in my experience, really tied into kind of why I ran for Welfare and Liberation and kind of the skills that I gained from both my part-time position and my full-time position. Following my sabbatical kind of time, I also volunteer for Disabled Students UK as their network director, and I'm currently employed as the representation coordinator at Birmingham Guild. So in terms of kind of career progression, I've decided to stay in the higher education sector as much as possible, and representation, as you will hopefully see, is quite an important thing to me now, and so that's where I've kind of put my efforts. So the beginning, campaigning, policy, and a little bit of a global pandemic, which I will touch on hopefully a bit later on. But something you should probably know about me, and I know this is not true of all people that are probably thinking of running, is I am a joiner. If there is something to join, I will probably join it. So pre-university, I was a college ambassador, disability advocate for my council, and was on a committee that advised the degree course on social work in my area. So when I got to university as a mature working class student, I basically joined everything. So I was my housing block rep. I joined the wheelchair basketball team and helped them start that. I did some fencing, some college day committees, I was a course rep, and interestingly, I was a freshers rep, so the people that volunteer, or the students that volunteer to help people come in at the start of the year, which was a very interesting experience as someone with my particular disability, especially when you're moving people in from their cars to their rooms. I was the heavy boxes please person, as I was not actually carrying them, my wheelchair was brilliant. But why do I think I'm a joiner? Mostly because I'm interested in culture, as that's my academic field. But I'm also interested in people and how we can learn from each other and our different experiences. So this is a picture that kind of was the closest picture I could get to why I started and running to be a part-time disabled students officer and to be a welfare and liberation officer, was just this sense of community. So when I started at university, there really wasn't really any community that I could see as a student, as a disabled student, that I could join. And this is actually a picture from the national wheelchair basketball competition, where you have 3 people that had never really met before, kind of in a concertinary position, if you can put it that way, kind of just chilling and hanging out. And that's something that I don't think any of us previous to that point at university really experienced. And so that kind of encapsulates my kind of ethos into everything I did as part-time officer and full-time officer. That kind of individual community then kind of turned into a more collective recruiting community. So this is our Disabled Students Association that I was president of at our Freshers Fair. And as you can see, like, we had members from the Trans Association, the People of Colour Association. So it really became this kind of collective kind of groupings of not just disabled students, but students from across the kind of diversity that you have at university, but it's not necessarily the types of students that would be visible at an event like this, even though they're very much in the student population. So what being a part-time officer gave me in my quite long role in that position was, first of all, like I've said, a sense of community. So a space that as a disabled student I could feel safe, accepted and valued, but also a kind of structural knowledge of how the university worked internally and who took action on issues for things around disability. That kind of going to committees and talking to other like full-time officers, talking to part-time officers from across the country through MUS, really helped build that knowledge. And that's not something you necessarily, I think, is a requirement for a full-time officer, but it's something that really I would encourage anyone to kind of look into for part-time officerships, because it's something that you really can explore, and then you can kind of get a taste of whether you're kind of the kind of person that really enjoys policy work or going to committee meetings, and then that could be the first step of a sabbatical officer career. That also, so being a part-time officer with a kind of smaller group of disabled students going to kind of smaller committee meetings really gave me the confidence to kind of how to act within those spaces, but also kind of how to push things further and have the confidence to go a bit further and a bit further in my personal campaigning. And it also gave the ability of breaking barriers. So by being president of SWADA, or the Students with Disabilities Association, we actually had an exec of students, which is quite unusual, but it meant that we had multiple students that would attend meetings, and it really broke down the stereotypes of what disabled students look like, how they act in meetings, like what the expectations could be. And it helped us form really strong relationships with the university through that kind of interaction. And it was just a bit fun. Being able to go to your vice chancellor and kind of school him on the realities of being a disabled student is never a particularly bad thing. I think it very much taught me especially how to be professional but honest in a room with people that are often or can be quite intimidating, and be confident in your own voice that it is valid and you have something to offer. And some people in certain places in a university really do need to hear it from you, even if that can be uncomfortable at times. So again, the activity side of both part-time and full-time officerships. In Squadra, we were very much supportive of the YUSU strikes and staff and student solidarity. And so that gave us experience of more external organisations and other groups of students that were doing really interesting work. And it's just a rather cool picture. Also, you don't really see many people in chairs on a picket line, so always like to flag that one up because it's kind of cool. But yeah, so life as a sabbatical officer specifically. So this is a bit stretched out, but this was my commute to work. You can't really see very well, but it's me on a stair lift getting to my office, which is something I really wanted to touch upon because I think as a disabled person, you are not necessarily the person in the room. And I think as a sabbatical officer in particular, whatever your disability is or however you identify, there's a really special journey that you go on, not only as a sabbatical officer in your role, but also as an entire SU having more disabled people around. And seeing someone in a wheelchair or someone with dyslexia or someone who's blind or deaf just every day and having that interaction that a lot of people both in and outside of an SU may not have the experience of. And that's like a journey for the whole institution, not just necessarily the individual disabled officer. And that's something I always touch on because there's some parts of the job that are challenging. And sometimes if you are the only disabled person in the room, which often actually isn't the case, there has to be kind of a shared understanding or a shared curiosity for you to have the support and the understanding for some of your work that you may encounter to work. I don't know if that sentence actually made sense. But basically it's a journey for everyone involved. So it's not just about the disabled sabbatical officer and their personal journey, it's also about everyone in the organisation that may pick up on things due to your identity that either wouldn't happen or aren't apparent in other spaces, and that's really important too. So what's it like? So everything is a basic answer to what it's like to be a sabbatical officer. I was in a unique position, I think, as a disabled welfare and liberation officer, that it was purposeful that I wanted to run for a position that dealt with welfare and mental health and extenuating circumstances and the like BAME students in the attainment gap and disabled students and reasonable adjustments and trans students and the difficulties with TERFs. Like you could go on forever about liberation issues. And we should go on forever about liberation issues. They're important. But I think that for me personally gave me an experience of campaigning on something in a professional manner that affected me personally. And it wasn't that I was accidentally in a role that was dealing with disability. It was that I was kind of consciously going into that role knowing that I was going to face some really uncomfortable conversations. But I was more than willing and knew that as someone that was a disabled student, I needed to be in that room to have those conversations at that level of the institution, and that a lack of representation had led to some things not being picked up, not because it was anyone's fault, it's just that the inherent knowledge that disabled students have was not in the room at the time that some important things were being discussed. That also meant that I got like, I really enjoyed having the 7 hats on, and anyone that is successful in their role will hear about these 7 hats quite a lot. So being a trustee, being an activist, being an advocate, being a campaigner, doing policy, you're kind of doing all of them at once, but they all have really specific skills in mind. I personally found out that I love policy and education policy and looking at lots of really detailed bits of paper and then challenging people in the rooms to kind of argue those bits of paper. I kind of really like that. I also really like, even though I like talking to students, and campaigning for me was awesome. And spoiler, I got to go outside and campaign. I would say it's sad, but also I don't miss the chilblains and being cold and being outside for 6 hours, and the amount of chocolate I ate in campaigns week. Although it was awesome. I think online campaigning is something that I did a bit of in my second round of campaigning, and I would say that having experience of it, you don't necessarily get the same feedback about how it's going when it's online, because you're not face to face with students, you're not seeing their faces, you're not being able to gauge their reactions. However, you can sit in the warm with a hot water bottle and hot chocolate and not have to go outside, which I personally found amazing. Because again, standing outside our library for 6 hours, again, I wouldn't recommend, but I loved it, which is how I kept doing it. So I think those kind of things are really important. As you can probably tell, I like talking a lot, but communication skills are actually really important in both part-time officer jobs and sabbatical officer jobs. I would say, and this is probably a bit controversial, it's probably a bit more important, a bit more difficult if you're a part-time officer, because you're balancing being a student and not necessarily having the same representative that sabbatical officers have from their inherent full-time paid positions. So being able to be persuasive at the same time as managing your academic commitments and being in a room where people don't really understand necessarily what a part-time officer does and how they fit into the system, is actually a really good skill to have, and gives you a lot of confidence when you then perhaps go into a sabbatical role and you have that title and you have that position, and then you have the experience of how to talk to people in those rooms. I found talking to people in committees and doing that policy work was where I was at home at, because I'd done it for like 2 or 3 years beforehand. So for me, that wasn't a personal challenge because I'd already worked up those communication skills. And I think I was once told by another individual that I could, quote, make senior executives of the university do pretty much anything. I couldn't, because if I could, I would have done a lot more. But I think it was just the recognition that I'd already had practice in certain spaces. So I kind of knew how to pitch things in a way that would be more preferable, but in a way that still got other people in the room to where I needed to get them to understand the issues. So yeah, so I think, and you communicate with a range of people. So I have a slide further on that I'll talk about, but it's not just university executives, it's kind of council members of your local community, it can be MPs, it can be students, depending on your role and your interests and your manifesto. You could be talking to anyone. I mean, I was in a meeting in my first couple of weeks where I was talking to bar managers of our local town, which is not something that I had planned for, and it was a whole different world. They were very nice. If any of them happened to watch this, thank you, because I kind of didn't know much about kind of things to do with Freshers Week and how the security works. And yeah, it was a very interesting meeting by the time I came out of it. But you will get experiences of things that you've never thought about, that you've never, like, you weren't aware even were a thing. I discovered that there was a lot more internal departments of our university than I ever thought they were, for example. So it's that kind of learning. I think as well in terms of personal development, and I think to bring it back to specifically disabled students, there was a lot of personal development that I did in terms of, I am a physically or primarily physically disabled individual. So I've always dealt with the kind of stigma and ableism that comes with people seeing my disability before they see me as a person. And I'm quite used to that. However, being in a room where you're already dealing with quite difficult and taboo policy, and you happen to be a visual reminder of a lot of the things you are discussing, made it really interesting in how I personally had to kind of navigate that room. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Some days I may have ate a bit more chocolate than others, but I think not to be afraid of those hard questions and not to be afraid of that difficult development is really important, because even though it is challenging, sometimes you need to be a person in that room. Like, you need to make people uncomfortable by your existence. And I've come to realize that that is an okay thing. And even though it's not always pleasant, there's things at the end of it that come out of it that are really positive, and that wouldn't have happened if certain people weren't in the room, i.e. disabled people, SABs that identify as people of colour. It's across the board when it comes to kind of representation, but I think disability has its own set of challenges. And I know from work with Disabled Students UK that that's not just if you look disabled, quote unquote, but that can be whatever your disclosure or non-disclosure is, whatever your conditions are. But that is a real interesting personal development point that kind of comes part and parcel with some of the work that you could be doing, and may not always be expected, I think. I think when it hit me personally, it was not on the things I was expecting it to. And conversations didn't always go how I expected them to. And learning how to deal with that, both on a personal and professional level, was really helpful to me personally. So I wouldn't be scared of that, but it's definitely something I would flag, as it is something that happens, and I think everyone should be aware of that. The exciting slide. Sorry, I get very excited about this. So this is a load of sabbatical officers sitting in a parliamentary committee giving evidence about mental health provision at higher education, and the launch of the Student Minds University Charter. I loved this. Words cannot describe how much I loved this. This was probably the highlight of my sabbatical year. I did get to Parliament accidentally 2 hours early, and I did get stopped by parliamentary security, and everyone got very confused and scared that the woman in a wheelchair was just stuck outside of Parliament on a very cold day. But it was beautiful. Like, words can't describe how beautiful that room is. I don't think the picture does it justice. But what was probably the most powerful is I don't think I've ever had an opportunity as a mature working class disabled woman to be brutally and unafraidly honest about the state of what is affecting students, and have the confidence to actually be as brutally honest. I may have not sworn, but there were some acronyms that I used in that conversation that I will not repeat, that were picked up on quite well. But I think that the idea that you have the privilege and the responsibility to be able to voice student concerns in places that they would not be heard if you weren't in the room is really, really important. And you get to do some really fantastic things. The woman I'm sitting next to was actually the sabbatical officer from Oxford at the time, their welfare officer, who also got some brilliant comments in, especially because we were, I think 2 of them were elite universities at the time. And so when we were arguing about the kind of lack or cutting of mental health services, there was a bit of pushback, to which we pushed back a bit more and gave them a bit of a financial lesson on the state of higher education at the time as well. Again, it was a blast. And I think if you're interested in kind of going to these different places and speaking to people that you wouldn't necessarily speak to, or if you're really interested in pushing a certain issue at national level, there is no better platform and opportunity than either being a sabbatical officer or even a part-time officer if you want to get involved in the NUS and work with other part-time officers on things. There's, I would say, less opportunity, but the opportunity is still there. And it is just something that you can really kind of get really deeply into, and it is something that is really personally fulfilling, and is personally the reason why I'm still volunteering for disabled students representation on like a parliamentary level, because I didn't really want to leave Parliament, I'm going to be honest, not as an MP, just as an activist, telling the truth when I didn't particularly want to hear it. But yeah, and it was, again, that was the highlight of my year. And I think it's one of the weird things, I'll just check my slides quickly, yeah, that a lot of people focus on running an election to get elected to the position. And as someone that has both lost elections and won elections, part of the absolute joy is figuring out what you're passionate about and having the experience of communicating that to other people. My favorite part of, I mean, obviously I enjoyed being elected, I'm not going to lie, but what I loved about the whole process was being able to speak to other students, be able to speak to my peers, and really have that conversation that campaigning itself gives you. So even if you don't win or you don't get the position you were looking to, it may actually spark something that you can carry on in other things. And if you enjoy campaigning, then that gives you a sign of, you might want to go into like the third sector or the charity sector or the volunteer sector. It's probably all the same sector, they give it different names. But that's something that gives you something in terms of a direction. And I think that's something that, aside from being a successful sabbatical officer, it really inspired me to kind of not stop when I stopped being a sabbatical officer. And so even if this video or this webinar is something that you think, oh, I might want to run for election, keep thinking about running for election, because the process of actually doing it is actually really interesting. And yeah, sorry, I talked for a long time, so apologies. That there's some information about my Twitter, which is hamsterxwheels, and my email address for disabled students, which is amelia@disabled-students.co.uk. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amelia. That was really interesting. Yeah, it's great information and advice you've given there. Before we end, we'll just thank you for putting up your contact details for anyone watching this back. But if anyone has any questions now, feel free to unmute or just put them in the chat, either for Amelia or anything about the elections in general.
Nick, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to unmute. Oh, yeah.
Got one for Charlotte.
Yeah, I'll let Charlotte go.
So the date for debate night is the Friday the 5th of March. Yeah, so it's in week 8.
Yeah.
No problem. Thank you for coming, Charlotte. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming, Amelia, and talking to us today. It's been so helpful. I'm sure students watching back will really appreciate it. And we'll finish there, and we'll send out the recording, and it'll be on our website.
Awesome.
Well,
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was awesome. And just, I would say, just as an end, like, I will again encourage everyone to have a good time during elections, because it is, as much as some of my comments may have been a bit on the darker side, it is an awesome position to have and to run for. So I wish everyone best of luck that is involved.
Laura, I'll just, Amelia, can you just hang on when
Yeah,
the recording finishes? Is that all right?
Yeah, we'll just stop it there.
Thanks, Charlotte.